The sound of helicopter blades thrummed overhead, drowning out the cacophony of the jungle as the squad of U.S. soldiers trudged through the dense underbrush. The air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel like inhaling through a wet cloth. Sergeant Blake, a tall, rugged man with a weathered face and sharp eyes, led the group. His hand stayed firmly on the grip of his rifle, as if he were waiting for the trees themselves to spring to life and attack. Behind him, Private Jake Thompson, a young soldier barely in his 20s, followed closely, his heart heavy with a mix of exhaustion and unease. He glanced at the line of Vietnamese prisoners being escorted by the squad, their hands bound, their faces blank as they marched in silence. Some were older, hardened by years of conflict, but a few looked barely older than he was. One, in particular, caught his eye. A grizzled man with deep scars across his face and a calm, almost defiant gaze. The veteran, Jake thought. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow and tried to focus. This was war, he reminded himself. These men were the enemy. But something about the look in the veteran's eyes unsettled him. He wasn't just some enemy soldier. He was a survivor, a man who had seen horrors Jake could only imagine. "Eyes front, Thompson," Blake barked, snapping Jake back to attention. "Yes, sir," Jake mumbled, gripping his rifle tighter. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though. The jungle around them felt too quiet, too still. The usual buzzing of insects and the distant screeches of birds were absent, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. As they approached the base, a hastily constructed outpost in the middle of nowhere, Jake felt the tension ease, though only slightly. The base wasn't much. A few tents, barbed wire, and sandbags surrounding a makeshift headquarters. But at least it felt somewhat secure, a brief respite from the suffocating jungle. Sergeant Blake ordered the prisoners to be taken to the holding area, an enclosed space near the edge of the base, reinforced with wooden beams and iron bars. Jake watched as the Vietnamese soldiers were marched into the enclosure, their faces still expressionless, but he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. They were just like him. Soldiers caught in a war none of them asked for. "Get some rest," Blake said, clapping Jake on the shoulder. "We're moving out again tomorrow. The intel says there's more VC nearby." Jake nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. As the prisoners were locked away, the veteran's gaze briefly met his. There was no anger there, just a calm, knowing look that sent a chill down Jake's spine. That night, Jake lay in his bunk, staring up at the canvas roof of the tent. The low murmur of the other soldiers' voices did little to soothe the unease gnawing at him. His mind kept drifting back to the veteran. How calm he had been, how different from the other prisoners. Most of the Vietnamese soldiers they captured were either defiant or terrified, but not him. He seemed to know something the rest didn't. A rustling sound outside the tent made Jake sit up, his heart skipping a beat. It was faint, like something moving through the trees, but far too close to the base. "You hear that?" Jake whispered to his bunkmate, Private Harris, who was already half asleep. "Hear what?" Harris grumbled, barely opening his eyes. Jake listened for a moment longer, but the sound had disappeared. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe the jungle was just playing tricks on him again, the way it always did late at night. He lay back down, closing his eyes and trying to calm his racing thoughts. Then he heard it again. This time louder, like something scraping against the base's outer fence. Jake sat bolt upright. His heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed his rifle, creeping toward the tent flap. He peeked outside, scanning the dark perimeter of the base. The moon was low, casting long shadows across the ground, but everything seemed still. No movement, no sound. Just the eerie quiet of the jungle. Probably just an animal, he muttered to himself, but the unease wouldn't go away. Before he could turn back, a faint whistle cut through the air. So high-pitched it made the hairs on the back of Jake's neck stand up. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't any kind of animal he'd ever heard before. Suddenly, the base's floodlights flickered on, illuminating the perimeter. The soldiers on watch duty were shouting, rifles raised, but there was no visible threat. "What the hell is going on?" Blake's voice boomed as he stormed out of the command tent, his face a mask of frustration. "Movement on the perimeter," one of the guards yelled. Something was out there? Enemy fire? Blake demanded, his hand on the grip of his rifle. "No, sir," the guard replied, shaking his head. It didn't look like the VC. It moved too fast. We couldn't get a clear shot." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. The floodlights cast long, twisting shadows, but there was nothing out there. Just a dense, impenetrable wall of jungle. Blake cursed under his breath. "Stay sharp. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it. And someone double the watch tonight." Jake exchanged a nervous glance with Harris, who had finally woken up and was gripping his rifle tightly. "What the hell was that?" Harris whispered. "I don't know," Jake replied, his voice tight. But it wasn't human. As the floodlights continued to sweep over the jungle, Jake's gaze drifted back to the prisoner's cage. The Vietnamese soldiers sat huddled together, quiet, their faces blank. Except for the veteran. He was sitting alone, his back against the bars, staring out at the jungle with that same calm, knowing expression. It was as if he knew what was out there, as if he'd seen it before. Jake's skin crawled. Whatever was lurking in the jungle, it wasn't just the enemy they'd been fighting. Something far worse was coming, and they weren't ready for it. The night is heavy with tension as the soldiers, now on high alert, take their positions around the base. Despite the floodlights and double patrols, an eerie stillness hangs over the jungle, amplifying the sense of dread. Jake can't shake the feeling that something terrible is about to happen, and the brief encounters with the veteran Vietnamese soldiers' knowing looks only deepen his unease. As midnight approaches, strange noises start to echo from the jungle, rustling leaves, faint whistles, and unnatural growls. The soldiers, already on edge, strain their eyes to see through the dense trees, but nothing moves. The quiet is suddenly shattered when the outer perimeter explodes into chaos. Alarms blare as something crashes through the defenses, moving too fast for anyone to get a clear view. Panic spreads as the creature makes its first appearance. It's unlike anything the soldiers have ever seen. A massive shadowy figure with unnatural speed and strength, tearing through the camp. Bullets seem to have little effect on it, and soldiers are picked off one by one, dragged into the jungle or brutally killed in its path. The creature is relentless, and despite their training and firepower, the soldiers are hopelessly outmatched. Jake witnesses the carnage firsthand, barely escaping with his life as the creature rips through the base. His comrades are slaughtered, and the survivors scatter in disarray, trying to regroup and form some sort of defense. In the chaos, Jake finds himself near the prisoner cage, where the Vietnamese soldiers are screaming and rattling the bars, desperate to escape. Amidst the confusion, the veteran Vietnamese soldier remains calm, though his eyes are fixed on the creature with grim recognition. He knows what it is, though he doesn't speak. His composure amidst the panic only deepens the mystery. As the night drags on, it becomes clear that the creature is not just attacking indiscriminately, it's hunting. One by one, it targets groups of soldiers, forcing them to retreat deeper into the base. The creature's speed and power leave little room for survival, and despite Sergeant Blake's attempts to rally the remaining men, morale crumbles. By the end of the chapter, the base is in ruins. Many of the American soldiers have been killed or are missing, and those who remain are scrambling to evacuate. Jake, traumatized and terrified, watches as the few survivors begin to gather at the helicopters to escape. But as the creature draws closer and the defenses continue to fail, Jake is faced with a gut-wrenching decision. to flee with his comrades or stay behind and do something about the prisoners still trapped in their cage. In a moment of fear and conflict, Jake realizes that the creature won't stop until it's destroyed everything. Jake's heart pounds in his chest as the sounds of gunfire, screams, and the creature's roars echo through the base. The helicopters on the far side of the compound are starting up, the remaining U soldiers desperately preparing to evacuate. He stands frozen in front of the prisoner's cage, torn between survival and doing the right thing. Inside the cage, the Vietnamese prisoners are shouting in their native language, their faces filled with terror. The younger prisoners pull at the iron bars, desperate to escape, while the veteran Vietnamese soldier sits calmly in the corner, his eyes never leaving Jake's. There's something in the veteran's gaze, a silent challenge, as if he knows exactly what Jake is contemplating. For a long moment, Jake hesitates. His training screams at him to run, to get to the helicopter and save himself, but his conscience gnaws at him. These men are prisoners of war, but they're still human. No one deserves to die like this, locked up and helpless. Blake's voice crackles over the radio, ordering all remaining personnel to the evacuation point. Jake's legs feel heavy as he takes a step back toward the helicopters. He glances over his shoulder at the cage one last time, his eyes meeting the veteran's steady, unblinking stare. In that instant, something clicks. He can't leave them. Cursing under his breath, Jake sprints toward the cage, fumbling with the keys. His hands tremble as he unlocks the door, and the prisoners spill out, some fleeing toward the jungle immediately. The young Vietnamese soldiers look at Jake with a mix of confusion and gratitude, while the veteran remains silent, giving Jake a single nod of acknowledgement. "Why are you doing this?" asks one of the younger prisoners in broken English. Jake shakes his head, too overwhelmed to answer. "Just run," he says. "Get out of here." But not all of them flee. The veteran Vietnamese soldier steps forward, his expression grim but resolute. He speaks to the younger prisoners in their language, commanding them to stay. Though reluctant, a few of them follow his orders, standing by the veteran's side. They understand what Jake already knows. There's no outrunning the creature. If they're going to survive, they'll have to fight. Jake glances at the veteran. "You've seen this thing before, haven't you?" The veteran doesn't reply, but the look in his eyes confirms Jake's suspicion. This creature, whatever it is, isn't just an animal. It's something ancient, something far worse than any enemy they faced in the war. Suddenly, the creature's roar splits the air, closer now as it tears through the base. The soldiers at the evacuation point scream as it descends upon them. Jake watches in horror as one of the helicopters, packed with soldiers, is ripped apart before it can take off. The realization sinks in. There's no escape. Panic grips Jake as the remaining U.S. soldiers scramble for cover. Many of them have already been killed, and the base is a smoldering ruin. The creature moves through the wreckage with terrifying speed, hunting down the survivors one by one. The veteran speaks up for the first time, his voice low and firm. "We fight," he says in broken English, gesturing to the few remaining prisoners. The young Vietnamese soldiers are hesitant but nod in agreement. Jake is stunned for a moment but then nods back. He realizes that his best chance for survival now lies in this uneasy alliance. These men, who were his enemies just hours ago, are now his only hope. Together, they begin to scavenge weapons and ammo from the fallen soldiers around them. Jake hands the prisoners rifles and grenades, feeling the weight of his decision sinking in. They set up a makeshift defense, barricading themselves in one of the remaining bunkers. The tension in the air is thick as they wait for the creature to come for them. Jake exchanges a glance with the veteran, who stands beside him with calm determination. They don't need to speak to understand what's at stake. The sounds of destruction outside grow louder as the creature tears through the last remnants of the base. It's only a matter of time before it finds them. As they prepare for the inevitable, the young Vietnamese soldiers whisper among themselves. their eyes wide with fear. Jake tries to block out the fear and focus on what comes next. His thoughts drift back to home, to the reasons he joined the war, and now, to the choices he's made tonight. "Thank you," one of the younger prisoners says, gripping his rifle tightly. "For helping." Jake doesn't respond, but he feels the weight of those words. He's no longer sure if this war ever made sense, but he knows one thing. He couldn't just leave these men to die. The bunker falls silent as they wait, weapons at the ready. The jungle outside is eerily quiet, save for the distant roar of the creature, drawing ever closer. The night seemed to stretch on forever, thick with tension as Jake and the small group of survivors huddled inside the dilapidated bunker. The air was stifling, and the metallic scent of blood mixed with the acrid smoke from the burning base. Outside, the jungle was alive with the sound of destruction. The creature was still out there, hunting, but for the moment, there was an uneasy silence. Jake sat near the entrance, clutching his rifle tightly, eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The Vietnamese prisoners, no, survivors, he reminded himself, were spread out across the bunker, each one armed with whatever weapons they had managed to scavenge. There were only 5 of them now. The others had fled into the jungle, their fates unknown. The veteran Vietnamese soldier, whom Jake had come to think of as the group's unofficial leader, stood quietly in the corner, inspecting a rifle with practiced hands. His face was grim but composed, as if he had seen worse than this. He hadn't spoken much since the decision to fight, but his presence alone was a calming force. The younger Vietnamese soldiers seemed to look to him for guidance, their nerves barely held together. Jake's mind raced with questions. Who was this man? How did he know about the creature? And why wasn't he afraid? Every instinct told Jake to ask, to demand answers, but something held him back. There wasn't time to worry about it now. They needed to survive the night. "Jake," came a low voice beside him. He turned to see Private Harris, one of the few remaining American soldiers, crouched next to him, his face pale and streaked with dirt and sweat. "What the hell are we doing, man?" Harris whispered, his voice trembling. This isn't right. We should be heading to the evac point. We should be out there." Jake shook his head, glancing at the others. "There is no evac, Harris. You saw what that thing did. No one's getting out of here alive unless we stop it." Harris looked at him, wide-eyed, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "You're talking about stopping it like it's possible. We've unloaded everything we had on that thing, and it didn't even slow down." Before Jake could respond, the veteran Vietnamese soldier stepped forward, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Harris's panic. He spoke softly in Vietnamese to the other soldiers, giving them instructions before turning to Jake. "You're right," the veteran said in broken English. "No one will escape if we run. We fight together or we die." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the tension in the room lifted. Jake felt a surge of determination as he nodded. "Then we fight." The veteran gave him a single nod in return before moving to the bunker's narrow windows, where he peered out into the dark jungle. Jake watched him for a moment, then turned back to Harris. "We don't have a choice, Harris. If we try to run, it'll pick us off one by one. We're stronger together." Harris shook his head, still unconvinced, but he said nothing more. Instead, he sank back against the wall, gripping his rifle with white-knuckled hands. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside the bunker, quick and light, like someone, or something, was approaching. Jake tensed, holding up a hand to signal the others. The bunker fell silent as everyone braced for the worst. The veteran raised his rifle, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at Jake. "Ready." A figure appeared at the entrance, stumbling in from the dark. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger, but he relaxed when he saw who it was. A young American soldier, barely recognizable under the dirt and blood that caked his uniform. He collapsed just inside the bunker, gasping for breath. Jake rushed forward, helping the soldier to sit up. What happened? The young soldier shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. It's coming. It got the others. There's no one left. Jake's stomach dropped as the words sunk in. Whatever hope they'd had of regrouping with the others was gone. They were on their own now, just a handful of soldiers trapped in the jungle with a monster that had already decimated the base. The veteran stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He knelt next to the young soldier and spoke softly in Vietnamese to one of the younger prisoners, who quickly fetched a canteen and handed it to the American. The soldier gulped down the water, his shaking hands barely able to hold the container. "We fight now," the veteran said quietly, rising to his feet. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. Jake turned to the others. "We have to set up defenses. It's going to find us eventually, and when it does, we hit it with everything we've got." They sprang into action, barricading the entrance and fortifying the bunker as best they could. The group moved with grim efficiency, driven by the knowledge that this might be their last stand. The younger Vietnamese soldiers, though clearly terrified, followed the veteran's lead, their eyes darting nervously toward the jungle every few seconds. As they worked, Jake found himself next to the veteran, who was silently checking the few remaining grenades they had left. Jake hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You've seen this thing before, haven't you?" he asked quietly. The veteran didn't answer at first, but after a long pause, he nodded. "What is it?" Jake pressed. "What are we dealing with?" The veteran's eyes remained fixed on the jungle outside. "It is not human, not animal. It is old. Very old." Jake frowned, trying to make sense of the words. "What do you mean? Like some kind of legend?" The veteran nodded again, his expression hardening. "In my village, we called it the Quái Thú, a monster from the jungle. It hunts those who come to its land. No one survives." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "How do we kill it?" The veteran glanced at him, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "We fight. That is all we can do." Before Jake could respond, the jungle outside erupted with the sound of crashing trees and the blood-curdling roar of the creature. The ground trembled beneath them as it approached, its shadowy form moving with terrifying speed toward the bunker. "They're here!" Harris shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Jake scrambled to his position, rifle at the ready. The others did the same, their eyes wide with terror as they braced for the coming attack. And then, in the blink of an eye, the creature was upon them. The bunker shook as the beast slammed into it, its massive form ripping through the outer defenses like paper. The survivors fired desperately, bullets ricocheting off its thick hide as it tore through the barricades. The air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the screams of the dying. Despite their efforts, the creature was unstoppable. It moved with unnatural speed and strength, slashing through their defenses with razor-sharp claws. One of the younger Vietnamese soldiers was pulled from his position and dragged into the darkness, his scream cut short by the sickening sound of bone snapping. Jake fired round after round into the creature, but it barely seemed to notice. The others did the same, their bullets having little effect as the monster continued its rampage. In the chaos, Jake spotted the veteran Vietnamese soldier, calmly tossing a grenade at the creature's feet. The explosion rocked the bunker, sending debris flying in all directions, but even that wasn't enough to stop it. The veteran grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him back. "Fall back." Jake nodded, retreating with the others deeper into the bunker. The walls trembled as the creature continued its assault, but for the moment, they had bought themselves a few precious seconds. As the dust settled, Jake locked eyes with the veteran. The old soldier's face was grim, but there was a fierce determination in his eyes. "We fight together," the veteran said quietly, handing Jake a grenade. Jake took it, his hands shaking slightly. "Together," he agreed. Outside, the creature roared again, and the bunker's walls groaned under the pressure. The final battle was about to begin. The bunker rattled with the force of the creature's relentless assault. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling as the survivors huddled inside, their weapons aimed at the entrance. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the walls groaned under the strain of the beast's attack. The darkness outside was punctuated by the creature's roars, each one sending a fresh wave of terror through the group. The survivors were barely holding it together. Private Harris was trembling beside Jake, his grip on his rifle so tight his knuckles had turned white. The younger Vietnamese soldiers exchanged fearful glances, whispering to one another in their native language. Only the veteran Vietnamese soldier remained calm, standing at the front of the group, his eyes fixed on the entrance. The creature wasn't just an enemy. It was something far worse. Jake could feel it in the air, a malevolent presence that seemed to sap the strength from them. This wasn't a normal battle. It was survival against something unnatural. "We can't hold out much longer," Harris muttered, his voice shaking. "That thing's gonna tear us apart." "We have to try," Jake replied, though even he didn't believe his own words. He looked to the veteran, desperate for some kind of answer, some way to survive. "There has to be something we can do." The veteran said nothing for a long moment, his gaze distant as if he were remembering something from long ago. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and grim. "It is not a creature of flesh. It is something older, from the jungle, from before men walked here." Jake swallowed hard. "What do you mean? What is it?" The veteran looked at him, his eyes dark and heavy with the weight of old knowledge. "In my village, there were stories. Legends of a guardian of the jungle, a spirit of vengeance, the Quái Thú. It hunts those who take from the land, those who do not belong. It is not an animal, not something we can kill with bullets." The room fell silent as the veteran's words sank in. The idea that this thing was more than just a wild creature, more than something they could fight with guns, sent a fresh wave of fear through the group. They weren't just battling a beast. They were fighting a force of nature, something unstoppable. Harris's voice broke the silence, cracking with fear. "You're saying we're all dead? There's no way to kill it?" Jake glanced at Harris, then back at the veteran. "There has to be something. You've seen this thing before. How do we stop it?" The veteran hesitated, his expression hardening. "It cannot be killed, but it can be trapped." "Trapped?" Jake repeated, his mind racing. "How?" The veteran moved to the back of the bunker, rummaging through the supplies they'd salvaged. He pulled out a crate of explosives, setting it on the ground with a heavy thud. "We lure it. We draw it to the heart of the base, where the fuel reserves are. Then we detonate everything. The explosion may not kill it, but it will bury it." Jake stared at the crate of explosives, the plan forming in his mind. It was a long shot. No, it was a suicide mission. But it was the only option they had left. The creature had already destroyed most of the base, and they were running out of places to hide. If they didn't take this chance, they were all dead anyway. He looked at the veteran, who stood resolute, his eyes filled with the calm acceptance of a man who had long since made peace with his fate. Jake nodded slowly. "It's a death sentence." "Yes," the veteran replied simply, "but it is the only way." Jake turned to the others. Harris's face was pale, and the younger Vietnamese soldiers were visibly shaking. But they all understood the gravity of the situation. There was no escaping this thing. They had to face it head-on, or they wouldn't survive the night. Jake took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "All right, we're doing this. We lure it in, blow the fuel reserves, and trap it under the rubble. It's our only shot." Harris shook his head, fear written all over his face. "Jake, this is crazy. We can't. We don't have a choice." Jake snapped, cutting him off. "It's this or we die running. We're already trapped." Harris opened his mouth to protest but closed it, defeated. He knew Jake was right. The fear was still there, but so was the grim understanding that they were out of options. The group sprang into action, quickly assembling what they could. The veteran took charge of rigging the explosives, instructing the younger soldiers on how to handle the charges. Jake and Harris gathered the remaining ammunition, readying themselves for the fight ahead. As they worked, the ground trembled again. The creature was coming back. Its roars echoed through the jungle, growing louder and more menacing. Time was running out. Once the explosives were set, the veteran gathered the group near the entrance. We will draw it in. Once it is inside the base, we retreat to the fuel reserves. We cannot let it see us until we are ready. Jake nodded. His heart was racing, but the adrenaline sharpened his focus. They were about to face death head-on, and he was determined to make every second count. The creature's roars drew closer, and soon, the jungle outside the bunker erupted with the sounds of trees snapping and debris flying. The Quái was near, its hulking form visible in the dim moonlight as it tore through what remained of the base's defenses. Jake exchanged a look with the veteran, who gave him a firm nod. It was time. The group moved out in pairs, keeping low as they circled the ruins of the base. The plan was simple. They needed to get the creature's attention without getting themselves killed in the process. They fired a few shots, deliberately missing the creature, just enough to catch its attention and lure it toward the center of the base. It worked. The creature let out an enraged roar and charged toward the noise, crashing through the remains of the buildings. Jake's heart pounded as they led it deeper into the base, closer to the fuel reserves. Every step was a gamble. One wrong move, and they'd be dead before they could set off the explosives. The group reached the fuel depot, the large tanks looming ominously in the darkness. The veteran began setting the final charges while Jake and the others took their positions, ready to make their stand. Suddenly, the ground shook as the creature appeared, its massive form looming over them. It moved with terrifying speed, its claws slashing through the air as it charged straight for them. "Now!" the veteran shouted. Jake and the others opened fire, drawing the creature closer to the fuel tanks. Bullets ricocheted off its thick hide, but it didn't matter. They just needed to keep it moving toward the trap. The creature let out a deafening roar as it lunged at them. Jake barely had time to dive out of the way as its massive claws swiped through the air, smashing into the fuel tanks. Gasoline began to spill out, filling the air with the sharp, metallic scent of fuel. "Get back!" the veteran yelled, sprinting toward the detonator. Jake ran, his heart pounding in his chest as he dove for cover behind a pile of debris. The others followed, ducking for safety as the veteran reached the detonator. For a brief moment, everything went still. The creature stood at the center of the fuel depot, its dark eyes narrowing as it turned toward them. Then, with a single press of the detonator, the world erupted into fire. The explosion rocked the entire base, a deafening blast of heat and light that sent shockwaves through the ground. The fuel tanks detonated one after the other, creating a massive fireball that consumed everything in its path. The creature let out a final agonizing roar as it was engulfed by the flames, its massive form disappearing into the inferno. Jake lay on the ground, his ears ringing from the blast. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he had been killed. But as the dust settled, he realized they were still alive. He turned to see the veteran standing a few feet away, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. The old soldier's expression was unreadable, but there was a grim satisfaction in his eyes. They had done it. The creature was gone. But at what cost? The world was still burning. Flames licked the sky, casting an orange glow over the shattered remains of the base. Smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating, and the ground was littered with debris from the massive explosion. The creature's last roar had long since faded, but its presence still lingered, an oppressive weight that hung over the survivors like a dark cloud. Jake coughed, struggling to push himself up from the ground. His ears were ringing, and his body ached from the blast. The explosion had thrown him across the base, and for a moment, he couldn't tell if he was still alive. But the pain in his chest and the heat from the burning wreckage told him he had survived. At least for now. He glanced around, searching for the others. Harris lay nearby, groaning as he struggled to stand. The two younger Vietnamese soldiers had also survived, though they looked worse for wear, blood streaking their faces and uniforms. But the veteran Vietnamese soldier was nowhere to be seen. Jake's heart raced as he scanned the wreckage, desperate to find him. Had he been caught in the blast? Was he dead? A knot of fear tightened in Jake's chest as he realized just how much they had relied on the veteran. Without him, their chances of survival had plummeted. "Harris," Jake rasped, crawling toward him. "Harris, are you okay?" Harris coughed, nodding weakly. Yeah, I'm good. What about the others?" Jake helped him to his feet, glancing at the younger Vietnamese soldiers. They were alive, but their expressions were filled with terror. They had been thrust into a nightmare, and their fear was palpable. Jake felt the same dread gnawing at his gut. The explosion had been their last shot, their final stand, and yet, deep down, he knew it wasn't over. Just then, a shadow moved through the smoke. Jake's blood ran cold as he heard the familiar sound. The low, guttural growl of the creature. The Quái Thú had survived. The others heard it too. The younger soldiers began to panic, their eyes wide with fear as they clutched their rifles, trembling. "No," Harris whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "We blew it up. We buried it." But the growl grew louder, more menacing. The flames flickered, and through the smoke, the creature emerged. Its body charred and blackened from the explosion, but still very much alive. It was slower now, its movements heavy with injury, but it was far from defeated. The monster's eyes glowed with a fiery rage, and it limped toward them, hell-bent on finishing what it had started. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. The explosion hadn't killed it. It had only made it angry. "We need to fall back," Jake shouted, grabbing Harris and pulling him toward the others. "We can't fight it here." The group scrambled to retreat, but there was nowhere left to go. The base was in ruins, and the jungle loomed just beyond the perimeter, dark and foreboding. The creature was closing in, and they were out of options. Just when all hope seemed lost, a figure stepped forward from the smoke. The veteran Vietnamese soldier appeared, limping but alive, his face grim as he approached the creature. In his hand, he held the last of their grenades, the pin already pulled. Jake's eyes widened in shock. "No, you can't." But the veteran didn't hesitate. He locked eyes with Jake, a silent understanding passing between them. This was the end. There was no more running, no more plans, only sacrifice. The veteran turned to face the creature, his shoulders squared and his expression steely. He was ready to die, and Jake realized with a heavy heart that the man had probably known this was how it would end all along. "Go," the veteran said, his voice low but firm. Jake's throat tightened, but he nodded. He motioned for the others to follow, and they began to retreat toward the jungle, their eyes never leaving the veteran as he stood alone against the creature. The Quái Thú growled again, its glowing eyes locking onto the veteran. It charged, its massive form crashing through the wreckage as it lunged toward him with terrifying speed. But the veteran didn't flinch. He stood his ground, waiting for the perfect moment. As the creature closed in, the veteran threw the grenade. The small explosive landed directly in front of the beast, and with a deafening explosion, the creature was engulfed in fire once more. The ground shook with the force of the blast, and the flames roared higher, swallowing the creature whole. But even as the fire consumed it, the Quái Thú kept moving, its charred form stumbling forward. Its eyes, though dimming, still burned with fury as it reached for the veteran with its massive claws. The veteran didn't have time to react. The creature's claws slashed through the air, catching him in the chest and sending him crashing to the ground. Jake watched in horror as the veteran fell, blood pooling beneath him. But the grenade had done its job. The explosion had been enough to finally weaken the creature, and as it staggered forward, it collapsed, its massive body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The Quái Thú let out one last agonizing growl before it went still, its body consumed by the flames. Jake froze, staring at the scene in disbelief. The creature was dead, but the cost had been too high. The veteran, the man who had saved them all, lay motionless on the ground. Harris, who had been frozen in fear, finally broke the silence. Is it over? Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He stepped forward, his legs feeling like lead as he approached the veteran's body. The man lay still, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. He was alive, but barely. Jake knelt beside him, his heart heavy. "We did it," he said quietly, though the words felt hollow. "You killed it." The veteran opened his eyes, his gaze weak but resolute. He nodded once, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to say something, to thank the man who had sacrificed everything for them, but the words wouldn't come. The veteran reached up, gripping Jake's arm with surprising strength. "My village?" he said softly, his voice fading. "It is safe now." Jake nodded, tears stinging his eyes. "Yeah, it's safe." The veteran's grip loosened, and his hand fell to his side. He closed his eyes, his chest rising one last time before he went still. Jake sat there for a long moment, staring at the man who had saved them all. The flames from the burning base crackled in the distance, but the world felt eerily quiet. It was over. The creature was dead, and they had survived. But it didn't feel like victory. Jake stood slowly, wiping the tears from his eyes as he looked around. The jungle was dark and silent, the only sound the distant hum of insects. Harris and the other survivors were standing nearby, their faces pale and haunted by what they had just witnessed. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their survival pressing down on him. The veteran was gone, but his sacrifice had given them a second chance. A chance to live, to make it out of the jungle alive. "Let's go," Jake said quietly. "We need to get out of here." The survivors nodded, and together they began the long walk back into the jungle, leaving the burning base and the creature behind. The jungle was eerily silent as Jake and the remaining survivors trudged through the dense underbrush. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced between the trees. The air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel like a struggle. They were alive, but the weight of their survival bore down on them like a heavy burden. Harris walked a few steps behind Jake, his face pale and his eyes distant. The two younger Vietnamese soldiers moved quietly, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. No one spoke. The events of the night, the deaths, the creature, the veteran's sacrifice, seemed too enormous to put into words. Jake's thoughts were consumed by the image of the veteran Vietnamese soldier, lying still after giving everything to defeat the creature. He could still feel the man's grip on his arm, his whispered words about protecting his village. The veteran had faced down death without hesitation, and now Jake had to live with that sacrifice. How much farther? Harris's voice broke the silence, shaky and uncertain. Jake glanced at him, his own exhaustion mirrored in Harris's eyes. "I don't know. We just need to keep moving. We can't stay here." Harris nodded numbly, but his steps were slow, each one weighted with the trauma of what they had just survived. Every rustle in the jungle, every distant animal cry, made them flinch. Though the creature was dead, the fear still clung to them. The jungle had become a place of nightmares, and they were still trapped in it. The group pressed on, navigating through the thick foliage, their movements mechanical, driven by sheer will to survive. Time seemed to stretch, the hours blending together as they trekked deeper into the wilderness. Each step was a reminder of the lives lost back at the base, of the men who hadn't made it. At some point, Jake stopped, his legs trembling beneath him. He collapsed onto the ground, leaning back against a tree as he tried to catch his breath. Harris sat down beside him, dropping his rifle at his side, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "We made it," Harris muttered, almost as if he didn't believe it. "We're still alive." Jake didn't respond right away. His mind was still processing everything. They had survived the creature, yes, but at what cost? The veteran's sacrifice had weighed heavily on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that their survival had come at too great a price. "We are," Jake finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't feel like it, does it?" Harris looked at him, his eyes hollow. "No, it doesn't." The two younger Vietnamese soldiers stood a few feet away, whispering quietly to each other in their native language. They looked as shaken as Jake and Harris, though their expressions carried a different kind of weight, a sorrow that went beyond fear. They had lost a leader, a mentor. The veteran had been more than just a fellow soldier to them. He had been their guide, their strength. One of the soldiers, a young man with a scar across his cheek, approached Jake slowly, his eyes filled with unspoken grief. He knelt beside Jake, speaking in broken English. He saved us," the young soldier said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our leader, he gave his life." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of the soldier's words like a punch to the gut. "Yeah, he did." There was a long pause, the silence between them filled with the quiet sounds of the jungle. Then the young soldier asked the question that had been gnawing at Jake since the veteran's death. "Why?" Jake looked up at him, his chest tightening. "Why?" It was a simple question, but the answer felt impossibly complicated. Why had the veteran sacrificed himself? Why had he fought so hard to protect men who, only hours earlier, had been enemies? Jake swallowed, trying to find the right words. He believed in something bigger than himself. He wanted to protect his people, his village, and I think he saw that we were all just soldiers. We were fighting the same fight, even if we were on different sides. The young soldier's eyes shimmered with tears as he nodded slowly. He was a great man. Jake didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded. The truth was, the veteran had been the bravest man Jake had ever met. And now that bravery had cost him his life. They rested for a few minutes longer before Jake finally stood up, motioning for the others to follow. "We need to keep moving. If we can find the river, we might have a chance to get picked up by a passing patrol." The group continued their slow march through the jungle, exhaustion creeping into every fiber of their beings. The night was starting to lift, the sky slowly turning a deep shade of blue as dawn approached. The cool morning air brought a brief sense of relief, though the memories of the night's horrors remained ever present. As they moved forward, a sense of quiet acceptance began to settle over the group. They had survived something unimaginable, and while the cost had been high, they were alive. They owed that to the veteran. His sacrifice had given them a second chance, and now they had to honor it by making it out of the jungle alive. But the jungle wasn't finished with them yet. Just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, a sudden crack echoed through the air. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he dropped to the ground, his rifle aimed in the direction of the noise. The others followed suit, their eyes scanning the jungle for movement. "Did you hear that?" Harris whispered, his voice tense. Jake nodded, his heart racing. Something, or someone, was out there. The group lay motionless, listening for any sign of danger. Then, from the thick foliage ahead, figures emerged. At first, Jake's breath caught in his throat, thinking it was another threat. But as the figures drew closer, he recognized the familiar uniforms. It was a U.S. patrol. Relief washed over him, and he slowly stood, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. The patrol, a small group of American soldiers, approached cautiously, their weapons raised. "Hold your fire," Jake called out, his voice hoarse. "We're survivors from the base." The lead soldier, a grizzled man with a stern face, stepped forward. "What the hell happened out here?" Jake hesitated, unsure of how to explain everything they had been through. It's a long story." The patrol quickly took them in, offering water and supplies as they radioed for a medevac. The group was safe now, but the weight of their ordeal still hung heavy in the air. As they were led away, Jake glanced back one last time, toward the jungle that had claimed so many lives. The veteran's sacrifice had saved them, but the scars of what they had endured would never fully heal. As the helicopters arrived and the survivors were lifted out of the jungle, Jake sat in silence, staring out at the trees below. The war wasn't over. The jungle wasn't done claiming lives. But for now, they had made it out. And as they flew away, Jake carried with him the memory of the man who had given everything so they could live. The jungle had taken much, but it had also shown them something rare. An act of true selflessness in the face of unimaginable horror. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales and deep dives into the mysteries of folklore and the supernatural. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about the story. Feel free to share them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the unknown.